Though he often posts his messages in Russian, this weekend, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky gave his first big interview to Russian journalists since the beginning of the war. He talked to 4 of them at the same time over Zoom. Now, as soon as the Russian government got wind of this interview, it put out orders to quash it, threatening the journalists with potential imprisonment over having their licenses to print news revoked. Of the outlets involved, those that are physically located outside of Russia published the interview. But the 2 papers involved that still operate inside Russia did not. One of those papers, Novaya Gazeta, suspended its operations completely today. They've been towing a careful line so far in the war, trying to report as accurately as possible while following all of the Russian government's censorship rules to avoid being shuttered. Out of fear that they would have their license suspended, this note today explaining they are stopping their work will be the last thing that they publish until the war, or as they were forced to call it here, the special operation on the territory of Ukraine is done. When you look through the other Russian newspaper involved, Kommersant, the interview with Zelensky is nowhere to be found. What you do see on the front page, however, is this, quote, Biden denies plan to overthrow Putin. This past weekend, President Biden generated tons of headlines in the West and in Russia for his comment about President Putin, saying, quote, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. The Russian press called it everything from a gaffe to an admission of the United States' secret long-term, quote, main goal. And unlike the interview with President Zelensky, the story was everywhere in the Russian press. And I mean literally everywhere. It was entirely unavoidable. And that makes sense because of a bold statement by the leader of the United States. But you would think that an interview with the leader of the country that Russia is currently at war with might get a little bit of attention too. But no. There's a lot of debate about President Biden's statement about Putin in the West, whether it was an accident or a piece of strategy, and getting to the bottom of that is important. But what I want to know is how did that line, Biden's line about how Putin has to go, how did it go over in Russia, given how much the Russian people are not seeing, how much they're not being able to read about the truth, the narratives they've been told now and for years? How might the average Russian have read Biden's words? Joining us now is Julia Ioffe. She's a founding partner and Washington correspondent at Puck and longtime reporter on everything Russia-related. Julia, thank you for being with us. Good to see you again. Let's talk about this. How do Biden's comments fit into the narrative that most Russians already believe or are being fed?
Well, the narrative they've been fed for a long time is the one that Putin believes himself, which is that for a long time, Washington has wanted regime change in Russia, just like it has pursued regime change all over the world. And this goes back to the days of George W. Bush and the Freedom Agenda and what the U.S. did in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then what Russia believes, or what Vladimir Putin believes the U.S. did or didn't do in Ukraine in 2004, in Georgia 2003, in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, and then in Libya. He sees it all as part of a pattern of the U.S. ousting leaders it doesn't like, and he assumes that he's next in line. And I think Russians are being fed this line that, see, they're out to get us. They're out to get your president. They want to impose their will on Russia. The question is, of course, can the U.S. actually implement such a policy, if this is a policy at all, rather than an aspirational statement? I don't think there's any talk by anybody sane or reasonable, or actually anybody in Washington, about actually going into Russia and toppling Vladimir Putin, which would be a pretty impossible task.
Yeah, and that's not how I heard it when I heard him say it. I suspected it was an unscripted comment. I suspected it was Joe Biden saying what he believed, and I suspected it was Joe Biden reflecting what a whole lot of people in the democracy-loving world believe. What's the distinction between it being policy? And I think we all understand that's not policy. The U.S. government's not going to take out the leader of Russia, but sentiment that Joe Biden can go around and share with people and maybe hope that the Russian people hear themselves.
I mean, to some extent, it was just a statement of fact, and it is a policy that the Biden administration has had from the very beginning when President Biden came into office, which was a recognition that as long as Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia, there will be no constructive change, no constructive dialogue, that very little in the way of any kind of meaningful cooperation or dialogue is possible as long as he's president. And so the US should just contain him, keep the do the bare minimum to keep that relationship going and not keep it from getting destructive, because this was the first administration, by the way, that Putin has dealt with that has not pursued a reset with him, right? That has seen things clearly, that Putin didn't want to play nice, that he didn't want to find areas of agreement with the U.S. because he sees the U.S. as his primary foe. So I just saw the comment by President Biden is in some ways a statement of fact and a statement of longstanding policy, which is that as long as Putin is in power, he's killing two countries, both Russia and Ukraine, and nothing constructive, no constructive dialogue is possible with him.